I guess it gives me great pleasure this morning to have a very high-powered panel, I must say. Many of the people who are working at the front line of some of the debates around not only just social housing, but how we think differently about human settlements in many of our cities and in many of our rural areas, and what role there is, of course, for local governance structures in that space. We're joined by the Deputy Director General at the Department of Human Settlements, Neville Cheney. We're also going to be joined in the next few minutes by Nomfundo Dlamini, Programs Manager at the South African Cities Network. Also joined by Dr. Chegula Mbanga, who's a Professor and Chair for Human Settlements at Nelson Mandela University in Nelson Mandela Bay. And also joined by Rory Gallagher, who is the CEO for the Social Housing Regulatory Authority. And maybe, Neville, I guess just as we start, what we're going to do with all of our panelists is just to give an opportunity to make some opening remarks for about 6 or 7 minutes or so, just outlining some of the work that you do, and more importantly, what resonance it would have for many of the people that we saw in that video, right through from Aluta to Zimkita and others who were profiled in that video. And similarly, we'll do the same Dr. Chegula, and also with you, Rory, as well. So Neville, let's start off with you briefly. Some of the work that you are doing at the Department of Human Settlements. I spoke about the Indaba that was held in March. And as I said, I mean, it seems like worlds apart from where we are now. But there were certainly some priorities that were outlined there. And I guess as you give us some of your remarks, it would be great to hear about some of those.
Chair, just to indicate a couple of things, and I think, I mean, I'll start off from the impact of COVID-19 and the post-lockdown priorities. So as the department, and I suppose as society worldwide and South Africa as well, we've had to recalibrate our priorities. And in doing so, I think, I mean, COVID-19 has raised a couple of red flags, which we already knew existed, but we didn't do enough. And I think that's particularly if you look at the issue around poverty, inequality, and unemployment. And I think what it has done in many respects is also highlighted the fact that there's a cost to the spatial inequality and injustice, and it's not sustainable. And for a very long time, there were no consequences to it. And I think what happened was that COVID-19 just indicated what the consequences, what the social and economic consequences are of that spatial inequality and injustice. And I want to just focus on one issue, and that's the issue of inequality. I mean, the one issue that we have dealt with, and I suppose that it receives a lot of attention, is income and asset inequality. But one of the things that we need to look at, and which COVID has sharply brought to the fore, is the issue around infrastructure inequality. And it's sometimes one of those things that gets lost in our focus areas. And why do I refer to this? Because the lack of infrastructure equality has resulted in lack of water, lack of sanitation. It's also led to a situation where we don't have sufficient security of tenure, equality in relation to that. I mean, the third issue that it has done is that it's confirmed the success, and I think what we need to understand is that the success of any sector, and particularly human settlements, is based on active participation and citizens and all of society. And what it has done is it's demonstrated that the long-held principle of social contracts work, and they must form basis of any plans. Why do I say that? Because I think post '94 there's been a disconnect, particularly from government and the state as well, that we have not, and there's been a dislocation of that. The fourth issue is that notwithstanding the substantial amounts of funding made available, value for money, quality and monitoring particularly, and I think this is one of the introspections we've done as the National Department, has not reflected what we've invested. I mean, as the national department, we on an annual basis over the last 10 to 15 years have been making allocations between 25 billion and 35 billion rand a year into providing water, sanitation, adequate housing, and title deeds to provinces and municipalities. And that in many respects does represent a substantial amount. Because I'm speaking about not over the, I mean, in total, we've probably, as a country, spent just under 400 billion since democracy in the program. And particularly it's exposed those fault lines in provinces and municipalities. So we've been caught napping on issues around the question of water, sanitation, and security of tenure. And the reason I'm talking about security of tenure, you would have known that during the course of COVID, there was a substantial amount of people that lived in backyards that were evicted, that resulted in some of this illegal land occupation.
Let me bring in Professor Chegula Mbanga, who is a professor and the chair for human settlements at the Nelson Mandela University. And Professor Mbanga, you have, I guess, same amount of time as Neville had. And just to briefly tell us about some of the work that you are doing, not only in the world of scholarship, but also one would think where scholarship is able to meet, community level organizing and even, I guess, able to translate into policy outcomes, some of which Neville referred to earlier on.
Thank you very much, Shayabonga, and also thank you to Rematinese and the Foundation for this opportunity to talk on this important subject of accelerating social housing in South Africa.
Sorry to disturb you there quickly. Do you mind just putting on your camera for us so that we can see you? We'd really like to see you.
Oh yeah, my apologies.
Thanks, Prof.
Thank you for that. We then look on human settlements as development projects, as basic units of city development, and therefore how they assist in reversing the patterns of apartheid spatial planning, which is a bigger issue when it talks about social economic inclusivity in the urban form. So we've got that type of a research which talks to urban space production and generally how the people who get into cities are received by the cities themselves, how they fit into these cities and towns as part of the broader urbanization phenomenon which is happening across the globe. But very briefly, I will say that, and strongly on issues of innovations and technologies, we also engage research pertaining to that with different role players. Your Department of Science and Innovation, and their agencies like HITIA, CSIR, water research commissions. We interface with them as we do with NHBRC at the human settlement sector level. We have got partnerships with them on various issues. But trying to move perhaps speedily on the COVID-19 and also the points that Neville has raised, I will say very briefly, I concur with the points that Neville raised. But I think something that we need to understand also when it comes to the impact of COVID-19 is our own form in South Africa. We've got a form that is a combination of urban and rural spaces, which have been impacted in similar and different ways. We've seen, I think Neville was speaking about the issue of infrastructure. We've seen people also in the rural areas trying to reach out where they were supposed to be staying at home, trying to reach out for water when there was a breakage on the infrastructure, or there may not even water infrastructure. They have to travel distances. We saw children, over their heads, and women having buckets of water, drawing water from the streams and the rivers, and competing with animals. We've seen that in the rural space. But we've also seen the challenges in the urban space as well, of the impact of the lack of basic services, with people queuing on the water tanks provided by government, and therefore social distancing not being much observed in those spaces, people talking to each other. We've observed that. We've also observed how people with chronic illnesses have struggled to access even healthcare facilities. And in those contexts that people stay in during the COVID-19. We've also observed the harsh realities of people who live on hand-to-mouth means. We're stuck at homes, I think, as we're getting from the video clips, with no other form of food or even shelter provision, and how that impacted on communities. The space constraints in the densely populated informal settlements, including the PNG houses, low-cost houses that are overpopulated, overcrowded, and where people had to self-quarantine, and what that meant for government as an intervention. We've observed all those issues. And perhaps lastly, on reflecting on COVID-19, we've also observed how government responded, I think, on this pandemic. Of course, it was a disaster, and the state of disaster was therefore declared. And then we observed how municipalities responded, and those capacity gaps that were showing as they had to respond to a multiplicity of issues and needs across communities. It came very, very, very clear. It was highly spotlighted, the lack of capacity to respond. And something perhaps we may need to think through as all role players in this space, our capability to imagine a crisis of this nature into the future, and the inadequacies of comprehensiveness of our strategies, not only as government across, including academia. Where were we not to even foresee that at this particular point we would be hit by this, and how ready are we for a next crisis of this magnitude as a country and countries? We also observe that and note that. Maybe just to conclude, I think perhaps on this point, this kind of paints a bigger challenge before us, not only government, but I think this dialogue, something I would want to underscore in conclusion around the dialogue itself, it regards the social housing and inclusivity. I think perhaps from some point of view, inclusivity of social housing perhaps may be looked at from different viewpoints. One is that of spatial equity and spatial justice, and need to involve everyone in these programs, I think, as a critical outcome of spatial transformation. I think would note inclusivity from a socio-economic integration point of view. We would note that. But I think we can look on inclusivity from a perspective of the involvement. I think Dr. Mambele Rambele makes the point about active citizenry. That it may be what we need to look to moving into the future about this cannot be a business of government only. Also never speak to that. And whether our policy framework is geared to enable participation by all, including communities and households, in the provision of their basic development needs.
Fascinating segue that you've given us to our next contribution from Rory Gallagher, who is the CEO of the Social Housing Regulatory Authority. And we know that within the strategic framework of the Human Settlements Policy Framework in South Africa, that in the next while, we're hoping to at least deliver 30,000 social housing units for rental to deal with some of the gap markets that Professor, you were speaking to. So I think it's the perfect segue, Rory, into, I guess, your 6 to 7 minutes or so to also share with us some of the work that you're doing as an authority, and I guess also maybe to respond to some of the issues that Neville and Professor Chegula have raised as well.
Thanks, Ayabonga. Thank you very much. In fact, I think the place to start is possibly where Dr. Rampele started. And it was borne out by your own clip and the descriptions that the participants made about what life is like for them. If you listen to Dr. Rampele, we need to actually, in a debate like this, we need to know or agree on what the problem statement is. On the one hand, is the problem statement about adequate shelter, which is effectively survival? We saw that gentleman who's got the sewer running past his dwelling. Or is the problem statement about poverty eradication? And poverty eradication is about creating jobs and about creating economic growth. So that's the starting point, because if you look at social housing and representing the Social Housing Regulatory Authority, as I do, we have to place social housing, we have to place affordable housing within an overall economic system and within what the economy is doing. I mean, if you look at some of the recent stats under COVID-19, GDP shrinkage of at least 7%, possibly going to get as high as 16%. GDP in the last quarter was just announced yesterday, compared to last year, shrank by 51%. Debt to GDP increasing from around about 60%, possibly going to reach as high as 80%. Unemployment increasing from around about 30%, getting possibly as bad as 37%. So it really is about what is the intervention from a government point of view and in a housing point of view within an economic context. And then Neville mentioned that when then the state responds and invests in the economy, one of the four main investment areas is upscaling social and rental housing. So even within the overall system, you have to place social housing within a bigger system, and what contribution does social housing make? So I'd like to propose to this webinar this question: which is the chicken and which is the egg? Because a lot of people think that you have the economy and you need a functioning economy so that you can have housing. But it's probably the other way around. We have housing investment and we invest in infrastructure so that we can have an economy and a thriving economy, so that people like the people in informal settlements, like the people in the clip, actually have real freedom, which is an ability to trade in an economy, buy and pay for housing themselves, because life is better, life is good, and there's money. So where does the SHRA come in? The Social Housing Regulatory Authority. Neville mentioned that government through the core department is investing upwards of 30 billion rand a year, a total of 400 billion since the dawn of democracy. Within that, the Social Housing Regulatory Authority has got a target of delivering 37,000 units. In fact, the president in the State of the Nation address announced the 37,000 units.
Rory, let me bring you in here, because I think you might also want to comment just on this conveyor belt I was talking about and how the rubber meets the road at a municipal level. But I also want to bring in and maybe overlay that with a question that's come through on the chat from Lauren Royston from Seri, who says, can we envisage a role for SHRA in regulating the provision and management of alternative accommodation when evictions happen? And we certainly know that evictions are a phenomenon you find everywhere. You find it as much in the eThekwini metro maybe or elsewhere in the urban space as you maybe would say in some of the more rural districts or rural local municipalities that we have. Some of your thoughts are just on the IGR framework and how we can maybe get better outcomes and better value for money, but also this question around regulating alternative accommodation in the context of evictions.
We like to start to behave in a way where we're projecting an assumption that everything that we do, including all policy choices that we make, are compromise driven. In other words, it'll be a bit of this and a bit of that, and ultimately everybody will be happy, and we assume we will never run out of resources. What if that is not true? What if we're wrong about that? So let's take Lauren's question, which is housing from a rights perspective. If we focus on housing from a rights perspective, and we don't do enough to make sure that the system itself is as efficient as humanly possible, every single cent is working, and every single cent is moving. There's no leakage. There is robustness. There is production. Capacity that is being hemorrhaged and value that is being destroyed is not destroyed. Construction companies are not going bankrupt. Transformation is real. There's real transformation in the economy as far as who is benefiting from the spending. If we focus on that, we will get what Lauren is asking for. If we focus on a rights-based approach and we take our eye off making sure that we have proper production and proper efficiency and proper effectiveness, a very clever advocate recently said, when we were looking at exactly what Lauren is asking about, which is what do you do in the current crisis with the resources that we have? That advocate mentioned something I won't forget, is that eventually, and not over a very long period of time, eventually, when we open the cupboard to take out the next social grant, the cupboard will be empty. So it's fine to take that approach for now in a crisis. We must, and in fact, I'm surprised Neville hasn't mentioned that in fact we are. The core department has been working with the SHRA feverishly over the last 3 months on a rent relief program, precisely to try to protect the most vulnerable, which is what Lauren is referring to. Our dilemma in the country is that if that becomes the norm, where we respond to most, because our poverty is broad-based, we have a poverty reduction obligation, which is huge, much bigger than a lot of our peers in other countries that we speak to. If we take our eye off the poverty reduction ball and pretend that we have enough resources to go on a rights-based approach and support all the vulnerable, while not doing enough to reduce poverty and to get the economy running strongly, the cupboard will be bare. We will not have enough resources to fund a rights-based approach to shelter for very long. Because I've given some of the most recent COVID-19 statistics. The situation was bad even before COVID-19. So I'm saying that yes, we will respond to people. People are not supposed to be evicted under the lockdown regulations. We must use our mechanisms in government, including the rental housing tribunals, to protect the vulnerable. Landlords must not evict people without justification if the contracts haven't been broken. But we mustn't think that evictions are never going to happen. And why are they never not going to happen? They're never not going to happen. And the reason why evictions are part of rental housing is because those very enterprises who are sometimes needing to evict a defaulter themselves must survive, must thrive, must contribute to the economy. Because if those organizations go bankrupt, it further erodes our prospects of having a strong and thriving economy, which ultimately hurts the poorest of the poor more than anybody else.
You often hear in the newspapers that evictions are happening in many of our metros and even in some of our rural municipalities. And so I guess it's an important point to underscore. But also the point that we need to get production and the demand going in the South African economy again, so that you don't find ourselves in a situation where even our focus on the fiscal side of things, we find that that space is limited in terms of what can be provided, alongside, of course, the role that other people can play, financiers, community organizations, and even, as we saw recently, cooperative financial institutions as well. Professor Mbanga, I want to bring you in here on a point you were raising just as you started making your remarks, which was, you know, the role that, you know, institutions like Nelson Mandela University and, you know, the role that you play as the chair there, how that contributes to the regularization of some of the work in this sector. And I want to bring that, I guess, to another point that a lot of people have raised, which is around recognition of prior learning, be it in the formal or informal sense. You saw in that video, you know, that, and even when there's been a shack fire somewhere, you find that there are people who are on hand, willing to set up new structures. And the big question is, how do you make sure that some of those people who already have some expertise, who have done this for a considerable amount of time, who might not have the certification, how do you make sure that they become part of the value chain, either as employees or even as entrepreneurs? And I also want to link that to a question Wandile Ndengo was asking, saying the students that are coming out of Kwano College at the University of Fort Hare and your university, Nelson Mandela University, in the human settlements programs, how do we make sure that in the budgeting that our colleagues have been speaking about, that there's some incorporation of not only bursaries, upskilling, and even postgraduate opportunities for them, so that we build some kind of a system of innovation within the sector as well that has a critical role for institutions of scholarship like yourselves?
I think you're raising a very crucial issue, but I will kick off by just before talking about those skills, that kind of a capacity that seems to be there, and whether that capacity helps to address the same problems that are being raised. Maybe that's the first issue to be raised, to be spoken to. Not only our university, truly, University of Fort Hare, University of Free State, and other universities have traditionally been offering housing programs as formal academic qualifications. But parallel to that, there's been ongoing short courses offered, both by government, by NHBRC themselves, with an agency of human settlements. That has been happening, and there's been this training, this culture of learning and development happening even at the municipality level, with workshops, training on this, on that. But how that has influenced or impacted on improving the actual delivery of human settlements, I think remains an issue to be looked at. My point on this, on the question you are raising, that I think we need to be evidence-based. I think the sense that we're picking is that we need to drive this program through strong evidence, which emanates from formal research that universities and other institutions would do on affordable housing and human settlements. But then that also bring in knowledge which is coming up from ground root engagements by civil society organizations, because there's a disconnect in the manner in which delivery is happening. I think Neville spoke to that issue, that the delivery model is mainly big contractor driven. When municipalities think about responding to a housing need, they solely think about a project that must be prepared and be funded and be implemented. And they immediately think about a contractor who would deliver at scale and with a high pace and probably with a good quality, when many times it's not always good quality because the main contractors will still subcontract and not properly managed on site. And we see things that we should not be seeing in the housing delivery value chain. I think there is room for improvements. There is room for engaging capacity, but that the opportunity is lost in the manner in which the housing delivery or development process is structured. We may call it a delivery model. If the municipality thinks about a service provider which is the case right now. Many, they think about a particular service provider. In fact, CSOs are struggling to engage municipality, and they are extending their hands to municipalities. We see some areas like eThekwini in KwaZulu-Natal, where certain CSOs seem to be active in a way, albeit with bigger challenges. Cape Town, we see also a bit of that in the Western Cape, but generally, it has been observed. Hence, during COVID-19, the CSOs engaged the human resource sector. I think Neville is here, which led to evolving what is called a partnership framework, which must still be rolled out into the future. But mind you, these CSOs are saying they have always been here since 1994 to support government. But how developments are structured, I think, is just that one, it must be competitive, fair, transparent. Therefore, to compete, you must tender out and people must come in with their scales. I think that is that reconfiguration of the delivery model, which will create space for the graduates from these universities to contribute. I once worked also for public works, because I worked in public sector before joining the university. And in the roads construction, we had what we called roving construction units, which were moving across a particular province to actually build, rehabilitate roads. I think maybe it may at some point be checked whether government is keen to move to a direction where it creates internal capacity to deliver on human settlements. You can't continue to generate skills, invest on bursaries, build capacity across the built environment, offer scholarship to engineers, architects, and then leave those to the private sector. It's a bigger issue, which also talk to the trust of the housing policy in South Africa, and whether it is inclined to government being an enabler, point raise, or playing a dual role in the development state, intervening at some point. I think that matter has not been clarified, but there has to be capacity. You cannot have, I might make this point, it might look funny. I discourage my own daughter for getting into a government as a built environment graduate or during the early part of her career, because I realize what will happen, that she will be managing tenders and not actually managing construction on site and dealing with bills of quantities, what she studied. That's what is happening. We produce the graduates which cannot be absorbed into government structures because they would play a different, we produce them for the private sector, if I could say. Is there anything wrong with that? There may be nothing wrong with that, but where it gets wrong is when that capacity is disposed into the private sector and yet does not benefit the improvement of quality and efficiencies in government. I'm saying that RPL will work when there are specific programs tailor-made for particular skills and reskilling, and projects are designed and described to allow for a space for communities with members with skills, for SCOs with skills to engage. We need a multimodal delivery model, not a single and straight line model, which is anchored on only the private sector delivering human settlement. We need a holistic, all-encompassing model, which even takes care of local knowledge, the abilities of communities in different areas of the country to provide for their shelter, and the skills they have accumulated over time from generation to generation. For now, we are an African country that is running like a modern and a Western country. I think it's something we need to address in our broader policy framework.
Now, I'm joined by one of our panelists who's just joined us now, Nomfundo Dlamini, who's a programs manager at the South African Cities Network. And Nomfundo, a real pleasure to have you join us. And just to give you a sense of where some of the debates are at the moment, we touched on some of the institutional questions, the role of the department in relation to other agencies that work within the ecosystem, also including within government, I guess municipalities for the purposes of our conversation this morning. But we've also been touching on sort of the skill pipeline within the sector, and how do we make sure that in how we think about informal sector upgrade, we get value for money, but we also have the kind of skills transfer and also facilitate some form of resilience that is linked to our energy transition, but also ensuring at this difficult moment where the labor market is hemorrhaging jobs, that much of what we do is as in employment and labor intensive as is possible. So maybe as we start off, just briefly, if you could tell us a little bit about some of the work that you guys do at the South African Cities Network and how that interfaces at a local level, and not only just with social housing, but I guess some of the other broader questions that emerge in the human settlement space.
Great. My name is Nomfundo Faith Dlamini. I'm the Programs Manager for Productive Cities at the South African Cities Network. And for those who've not interacted with our organization before, we are a knowledge-based research institution that works pertaining to urban development. And so we've got close liaison and relations with COCTA through the IUDF program. And we primarily work in close proximity to our member cities that constitute of the 8 metropolitan cities within the South African context. And truly, as was being said, our focus areas really delve from looking at issues of inclusion, looking at issues of productivity, so that pertains to your economic development focal areas. We have the built environment, and spatial transformation contingent, as well as looking at issues pertaining to governance and sustainability. And so the work that we do, and one of the things that we primarily premise our strength on, is always being the liaison entity that is often able to assist in advocacy for the local government state. And like I've mentioned, we work in close proximity with our member cities. So from city leadership, your practitioners, the individuals who are often responsible for implementing the very targeted interventions. And we foster, I think, primarily a reference group element, so a stakeholder formation, whereby we also are quite integral in ensuring that there is discourse and there's dialogue, and that we assist the cities in developing city development strategies, as well as fostering more partnerships and elements of best practice within the institutions, so that they also are having an element of intergovernmental relations that often doesn't tend to exist within the formalized structures.
The professor was also talking about employer-provided housing. I'm quite interested, I guess, in where you see that playing a role in a complementary fashion, in a fiscal outlook that certainly is narrowing in its space to be able to inject a lot of stimulus into our economy. So what's your view on what role the private sector can play, what role pension funds can play in being able, I guess, to get us across the line, not only from a funding perspective, but also even in terms of, I guess, the content of the construction and even potentially later on operation and handover?
You know, the classic example, Ayabonga, of where that has been successful is if you look at Soweto. You know, when Mayor Masondo was there, I mean, one of the things that he did was put in the water, put in the sanitation, tar the roads, put in the street lighting, and the private sector investment followed. So you know, that is a typical situation that one would say that, you know, there's government leads, private sector follows, and you know, there's a good synergy around that. But we have not seen that in a lot of the other areas. But I think it's just important to note, and I think Dr. Rampele's put the question out there on the question of the money that we've spent. I mean, I don't want to leave the impression that all of the money that we've spent cannot be accounted for.
As we take some of the closing remarks, and I know my panelists have also been checking what's been happening in the chats as well. Nomfundo, I'm going to start off with you, and we'll maybe close off with Neville as well. Just on maybe some of the 2 or 3 things that you feel in the immediate, during this period of reconstruction and recovery from COVID-19. How do we get, I guess, some of the issues you're raising around the political administrative interface? How do we get that right as a critical feature of how we think of recovery and reconstruction in the human settlement space at a local level?
as much as I appreciate, especially the technical elements that are coming through, especially with Dr. Mbanga's sentiments, would be how is it that we can even revisit the kind of infrastructure that's in place, to not turn a blind eye, but to say what kind of system and promulgation will need to be undertaken by these various state entities in partnership with private sector, as well as the community and the household, to also foster that element of ownership. And so I do feel that inclusionary housing would require a lot of decoding in terms of what is currently within the government prescripts. As much as I respect and I understand the work of your social housing institutions, often at times the monitoring and evaluation in terms of what it is that actually transpires, especially pertaining to things like rental collection, will lead to the dilapidation of these processes. One of the things that I'm not too sure, Ayabonga, if it was discussed within the panel earlier on, is also how it is that we can foster the collaboration in learning and development culture within the sector. And I think that has to be something that must be research focused and empirically based, evidence centric, so that we are actually acquiring the knowledge base. So as much as we have the financial statistics that can attain to how much it is that it will cost us to refurbish and establish units, let's also try and find out the viability and those kind of modalities, because often at times, and also understanding the dispensation of South Africa and how it is that housing has been attributed, is that people are of the understanding that even social housing means that I own it.
Professor Mbanga, let me get some of your closing remarks, and I guess maybe a similar question to you as well, some of the things that you think can be done in the immediate.
We need to get into a proper diagnosis of the environment. Who are the key actors and what could be their responsibilities? What are they bringing to the table? And in which way can they be supported? I think an enabling approach to creating more dignified human settlements would definitely do that. I'll say just very briefly, that's my view in conclusion. What that does, it directs us, I would say us, in also understanding what kind of skills program will require and what kind of entrepreneurial support program will require within that broader ecosystem, and localize those interventions, because national government may only create frameworks.
Rory, let me give you an opportunity also to make some of your closing remarks, and then thereafter, DDG Neville, you'll make some of the closing remarks, and we'll get Luvuyo to also give us a vote of thanks and also some closing remarks as well.
We need to interrogate the nature of the crisis and try to seek out where opportunity exists in the crisis. We've been having a discussion at the SHRA about the concept of resilience, because things like resilience, these have been kind of bandied around for years. Resilience, agility, innovation. Now is when we need to make concepts like resilience, innovation, and agility very real. So we need to give ourselves a chance to realize that, in fact, we are resilient as actors in this economy and in this society, whether you're a public servant, whether you work for the SHRA, whoever you are. And we need to take this opportunity to learn new tricks. The SHRA has already worked out, and most organizations have, how to deliver the same public service much cheaper. So we need to learn these new tricks. And part of resilience, two more points and then I'm done, is we need to work out where we need to make changes in the way we do things that are structural in nature.
Dr. Rampele raises, you know, one of the good things that we think will come out of the refocusing and repurposing of our programs to focus on informal settlement upgrading, as well as the rapid land release, is that what it will do is it will democratize, for want of a better way, better word or expression, the current process, because as I've indicated, the current process has just been too driven by a select group of private sector professionals, and no offense to any one of them, because in doing that informal settlement upgrading, we will then, because as I've said before, in the process of informal settlement upgrading, in the process of rapid land release, there's no place to hide, because the community and the households form part of that process.
And let me give over to Luvuyo Matasa from Reimagine SA to just give us some closing remarks and also, I guess, some announcements and thanks yous on the part of the organizers, Reimagine SA and the Nelson Mandela Foundation.
Thank you very much, Ayabonga, and thank you for everyone who's made the time to join us this morning. I'd like to share a very brief anecdote that hopefully gets the point across. So some years ago, I missed my youngest sister's birthday. She was turning 6 at the time. And in trying to explain to her, I said, happy belated birthday. And she asked me, as all innocent young people ask, what does that mean? And to that point, I then said, happy belated happens when someone misses your birthday. And to which she asked me what I was doing, couldn't remember. And she made a very simple point that all it would have taken was a 30-second phone call to say happy birthday, and you could have gotten back to everything that you were doing. Now, the simple point here made by a 6-year-old is that we as adults have the unfortunate habit of making things complicated. And this is not to diminish the importance not only of this conversation, the reality that we find ourselves in, and the context that we're trying to solve for the human beings that were shown in the fieldwork interviews. It is always important for us to identify the simple thing that needs to be done and simply do it, because the people who need it will understand that sometimes it just takes a 30-second phone call to wish them a happy birthday. With that said, I would like to send a great message of thanks and appreciation to our panelists, the Deputy Director General Neville Cheney of the Strategic Planning at the Department of Human Settlements, Nomfundo Dlamini, Programs Manager at the South African Cities Network, Professor Sijegula Mbanga, at the Nelson Mandela University, Rory Gallagher, CEO of the South African Housing Regulatory Authority. And although they didn't want to be mentioned, I think it is very important for us to thank our sponsor for the conversations, both in this whole exercise from the City of Tshwane workshop that was hosted last year, into the work that has been done up until this point, to the APSA corporate citizenship team that is responsible for strategic initiatives and engagements. Thank you for your support and for finding value in this conversation. To everyone that has made the time, the contributions during this webinar, and has shown a vested interest in making sure that human beings are taken care of, we do what matters to put dignified shelter and significant investments in solving for South Africa's issue of a divided past that seems to be quite stubborn and continuing into our day-to-day and unfortunately into the future that we no longer want to see it being part of. To everyone, Sithi Siyabulela, thank you for making the time. And this is but one of many engagements that we as Reimagine SA, and this particular webinar is in partnership with the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Sithi Siyabulela, Ningadinwa Nangoms. Thank you and have a great day. And we look forward to sharing the results from this engagement and the reports that come from the very many pieces of information, both academic and in field research that have come through. Siyabulela, have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Luvuyo. That's it, folks. Thank you. Take care and enjoy the remainder of your afternoon.